We're going to be reading from Luke chapter 10, verses 38 through 42, a story that might be familiar to you if you've been a believer for a while, if you've been a follower of Jesus. This is a story perhaps you've heard, but allow yourself to enter into the story anew. It's amazing how God's word speaks over and over again. Sometimes he speaks into our heart in fresh ways, in new ways, even with familiar passages. And so open up your heart and your life and your eyes to what you see, to what you hear, and to what you feel as God's word gets heard and preached this morning. Luke chapter 10, we begin at verse 38. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister's left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is needed. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." Thanks be to God. Question: what's the opposite of the word busy? Idle. Good one. Opposite of the word busy. Idle. What else? Sorry? Relaxed. Okay. Lazy. Some of them not very positive words, are they? Relaxed is a good word. But lazy, idle, inactive, not very positive words. Derek, if you don't mind, I'm going to move that back just a bit. You can move it back when you come up. I want to be able to see these folks too. Not very positive words. No wonder then that so many of us like to be busy. I mean, pastors especially want to be busy. What minister would want to be known as a lazy pastor? That's why most of us, especially as pastors, although we're going to see in a moment that this applies to a lot of us perhaps, but that's why many of us as pastors take the word busy as a kind of compliment. That's why I tend to take it as a compliment, almost a badge of honor, really. My pastor, you keep yourself so busy. And I think to myself, thank you very much. You noticed. Yes, I am quite busy. Imagine then how this sentence, when I read it for the first time, it's in a book by Eugene Peterson, passed away recently, but many of you have read some of his books. And he was known as sort of a pastor's pastor. He often wrote about pastoring and wrote to pastors. And I read this sentence once. Imagine how it grabbed my attention, knowing how busy I like to be. I read this. He said, "The one piece of email in my inbox certain to get deleted is the one addressed, 'Dear busy pastor.' Not that phrase doesn't describe me at times," Peterson said, "but I refuse to give my attention to someone who encourages what is worst in me," he wrote. And I said, what's worse than me? Busyness? Wow, really? What we're going to be reminded of this morning as we look at this story of Mary and Martha is that busyness, though it describes many of our lives much of the time, that busyness is not necessarily a complimentary adjective for any of us. Not that we're supposed to be lazy or idle. That's certainly not the point. But neither are we to be busy, at least not busy in that frantic sense, which is how many of us often experience. In fact, busyness in that sense is not necessarily equal to faithfulness in the Christian life. In fact, Peterson says it might even be a sign of defection. In other words, a turning away from our primary task and our primary calling as believers of Christ. He says busyness may at times be a symptom of defection rather than a symbol of devotion, a symbol of turning toward Christ and turning toward our calling as his children. Martha and Mary, these two sisters in our text this morning, lived in the village of Bethany. Luke doesn't tell us that, if you noticed, Luke chapter 10. He simply says that Jesus and his disciples came to a village. But we know from John's gospel, John tells this same story, we know from John's gospel that that village was Bethany, just 3 kilometers from Jerusalem. In fact, you could see Jerusalem in the distance over the valley. They appear, these two women, Martha and Mary, they appear a number of times in the Gospels, and typically Martha is mentioned first. It's Martha and Mary every time we meet them, not Mary and Martha. And that's led some commentators to think that Martha was the elder of the two. That would be normal to mention in Jesus' day, the elder one first and then the younger. Can't be 100% sure of that, but at the very least, when we encounter them in the Gospels, she's the one that we see typically taking the lead. And of course, that was the case in our reading this morning as well, wasn't it? It was Martha, we're told, who opened the door, who welcomed Jesus into their home. Our home is your home. That was always the way that it had been with Martha and Mary, sort of their motto, really, when it came to Jesus. And so whenever he was in Jerusalem or in the surrounding area, this is where he put his feet up. This is where he put his head down at night in Martha and Mary's home. And of course, we learn elsewhere that it was also the home of their brother, Lazarus. So, Martha extends the welcome. Jesus is making himself comfortable in his favorite chair. And where's Mary in the passage? Well, not surprisingly, Mary is at Jesus' feet. And I say not surprisingly because it seems like that's often where we find Mary in the gospel. At Jesus' feet. In John chapter 11, she falls at Jesus' feet to express her grief over the fact that Lazarus had died. You remember she called for Jesus. Jesus came and in her understanding came too late, and she was at his feet in grief and in sorrow. In John 12, she gets down on the floor. We see her in this lavish kind of act of devotion where she pours perfume on Jesus' feet and then wipes his feet dry with her hair, with her apparently long hair. And now here in our text, Luke 10, she's at Jesus' feet again, sort of taking in every word that comes out of his mouth. While Mary worships, Martha gets busy. There's so much to get done. Most commentators believe that the disciples were probably there as well, because we're told that they were traveling together. And so there were probably at least 15 mouths to feed. The 12 disciples, Mary, Martha, Jesus, maybe even 16 mouths if Lazarus is there. The turkey needed basting, and the table needed set, the candles needed lighting, the cloth napkins needed folding, the silver needed polishing in terms of how we would prepare a meal. The fresh flowers needed arranging. You know the drill. It needed to be perfect. The I's needed to be dotted, and the T's needed to be crossed. Everything had to be the way it was supposed to be. Everything had to be as Mary assumed others would expect it to be. And as a result, Martha was pulled apart, we're told. That's what this word in Luke that he uses, the word Luke uses in verse 40, it's what it literally means, this word where Luke says she was distracted, or that's the way the NIV translate it. She was pulled apart in every direction. Coming apart at the seams is really sort of the heart of the meaning of the word. Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. And I mean, who wouldn't feel for Martha? I mean, really, there's one more email to be answered. You know how this goes, right? There's one more child that needs taxied. There's one more report that needs drafted. There's one more garden to weed. There's one more errand to run. There's one more present to purchase. There's one more meeting to attend. And why won't you help me? Why are you just sitting there? Don't you see I'm stressed out? I'm pulled in every direction. What makes us so busy? You know, in the book that I read, this book I referred to earlier, the book by Eugene Peterson, he says this. He was talking specifically about pastors, but I wonder how much more broadly it applies. He says, what makes us so busy? Listen to his answer. Vanity. I am busy because I am vain, he writes. I am busy because I want to appear important to you, significant. And what better way than to be busy? The incredible hours, the crowded schedule, the heavy demands on my time, they're all proof to myself and to anyone else who will take notice that I'm important. I know that too often that's true for me. When I get right down to it, as we were encouraged to this morning in our time of confession, when I go deep within and I listen to those rumblings that are in my heart, I know that sometimes my busyness is about getting my ego stroked. That's what pulls me in every direction. I want to believe that I'm indispensable. There's something inside us that, at least at times, refuses to acknowledge our humanity, our God-given limits. That's what it means to be a creature and not the creator. The limits of our humanness. We think if something needs fixing, it's mine to fix. As if I'm the Messiah. As if I'm the one called to save the world. Recognizing my own limits is a way of reminding myself again and again that there's only one God, and I'm not him, and you're not him. Nor am I called to be him, or you called to be him. I'm called to join him in what he's doing. I'm to be a partner with him in the work that he's doing in the world, but I'm not to be the one in control. I'm not to be Lord. I'm to be partner. Well, in response to Martha's whirlwind of activity, Jesus had this to say. First, he repeated her name twice. Martha, Martha. Maybe that was a way of getting her attention. Maybe it was a sign of his disappointment, his concern. It was maybe like when my mother used to say, Sean Ronald. Maybe. It might have also just been a sign of Jesus' tender affection. Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things. The words that Jesus used, worried and upset, come from a root word meaning to go to pieces. So we're back at this idea again of being pulled apart. Martha, you're allowing yourself to go to pieces, but only one thing is needed, he said. And that one thing is what Mary has chosen. She has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. So who are you? Which one are you? A Martha or a Mary? That's often how this passage gets preached, right? Perhaps I've even preached it that way before. I'm not sure. But it sometimes gets preached, or we read it and sometimes hear it as if we're supposed to be one or the other. Am I supposed to be a Mary or am I supposed to be a Martha? And of course, the right answer is always Mary. She's always the one who comes out looking on top. But that can't be the point of the message, can it? I mean, look where Luke places this story in his gospel. Look at the context around it. He places it right after the parable of the Good Samaritan. The Samaritan, as you know, took pity on a man who had been beaten and who had been left for dead at the side of the road. And this Samaritan washed this person's wounds. He bandaged their wounds, and then he took the man to an inn. Imagine the time being invested. And he cared for him there in the context of the inn, and eventually he then paid the bill in full and made it clear that he would look after whatever else needed looking after. And Jesus says that's what it means to be a neighbor. In fact, Luke says in his gospel, now you go and do likewise. In other words, you go and get busy with my kingdom work. Think about it. It's not as if Jesus, in this passage, Mary and Martha, is telling us not to be serving, right? Romans 12 says if your gift is prophesying, well then prophesy in accordance with your faith. If it's serving, well then serve. And if it's teaching, then teach. If it's to encourage, then give encouragement. If it's giving, then give. Give generously. If it's to lead, do it diligently. If it's to show mercy, do it cheerfully. The Apostle Paul told the Corinthians to imitate him in the same way that he imitated Christ. Well, if Paul's life was marked by anything, it was marked by incredible sacrificial service. That's what I'm to imitate. No, the point that Luke was making in sharing the story of these two women is not, be like Mary and don't be busy. Don't be about work. Don't be engaged in service. No, it's not that Martha should have been, that Martha shouldn't have been serving. What he wanted Martha to know, what he wants us to know, in fact, is that all of our service, all of our reaching out, all of our busyness in the kingdom, community barbecues, that all of it needs to flow out of a deep, abiding, personal relationship with Jesus. In other words, our doing for Jesus needs to arise out of our being with Jesus. It has to come naturally, our doing, from our being. Jesus said it this way, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me, if you abide in me, you will bear much fruit. But apart from me, you can do nothing. The doing, the growing, needs to come out of the abiding, the being in Jesus. Because apart from him, he says, you can do nothing. Imagine if all your busyness in the end, imagine if all your busyness amounted to nothing. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Nothing of lasting value, nothing of eternal significance. Jesus said, unless you're living in me and I in you, all your running and chasing and striving will amount to nothing. It's only that which flows out of a sort of dynamic, living relationship with me, Jesus says, that will really bear fruit. Few things are as damaging to the life of a Christ follower than trying to work for Christ without taking time to simply be with Christ. It's the pattern Jesus lived. When you think about it, we see that clearly in the gospel, this rhythm that he had, a rhythm of active service followed by quiet retreat. Dynamic ministry followed by intentional withdrawal. Well, if so for him, if that's the pattern that Jesus needed to sustain his ministry, then how much more so for me? Practicing silence before the Lord. Practicing being alone in his presence. Practicing the discipline of rest. That's how our soul is fed and our spirit is nurtured. Sabbath is all about learning to live those disciplines. Silence, solitude, rest. Jesus understood that. Mary understood that. And we need to understand that. Our service, our doing, if it's to amount to anything, needs to flow out of our Sabbath. It needs to flow out of our rest, our solitude. As some of you may know, one of the hats that I wear is regional pastor for Classis Quinty, the regional family of churches that you belong to and that we in Peterborough belong to. Essentially, kind of a regional pastor is a pastor to the pastors, basically. And so I am so encouraged by your willingness, by your commitment to make a Sabbath, a sabbatical, available to Pastor Brad. He told me earlier this week, he and I met and walked and had a coffee together, and he told me earlier this week that the anchoring verse that he's sort of leaning into for his sabbatical is from Psalm 46, be still and know that I am God. Stillness is hard for him. You know that. Actually, it's hard for many of us. But you've blessed him with this season of learning a new rhythm. Rhythm that will renew him now, for sure, but a rhythm, hopefully, that will sustain him then into the future as well as he lives more fully into that rhythm. And so pray for him in that regard. Pray that as a branch, he might draw deeply from the vine, so that in his doing, he will bear even greater fruit. The fruit that flows out of the reality that he's being with Jesus. But this isn't about Pastor Brad. He's not even here today. This is about you and about me. What is it in your life that's driving you? Who's setting my agenda? Who's establishing our priorities? In what ways might your busyness be a sign of defection to Jesus rather than a sign of devotion to Jesus? Your date book, I still use, a date book, pen, paper, or the calendar on your phone, which is probably what most of you use. But however it is you use to order your days, that tool is your friend. It's your friend if you use it well. Schedule in, actually block off the time, 2 to 3 hours, whatever it is. Actually schedule the time for Sabbath. That time's taken. Oh, sorry, no, I have a commitment then. And you do. It's a commitment that you've made to be with God. Block it off on your calendar. That's time taken. It's time set aside. Or set a notification. I talked to someone not that long ago who for a month committed to set a notification on their phone every hour during the waking hours. Every hour they received a notification. And the notification for them was intended to remind them to pause and to notice where God was present in that moment. That's a challenge I haven't taken up. But even set a notification a couple times a day, a reminder when it dings to take 15 minutes to walk, to pray, to listen to God, to sense where he is around you. Or use an app like Lectio 365, one of my favorites, and allow it to send you reminders. You haven't spent time yet in the app. You haven't spent time yet in prayer and in reading. The tools are there. The tools are gifts. Because here's the reality. You know this. I know this. If we're not deliberate, if we're not intentional, if we're not purposeful in marking times for silence, for solitude, for Sabbath, for sitting at Jesus' feet while the rest of the world swirls by, you'll be sucked into the frenzy. And you'll miss out. I'll miss out. Sean, you were distracted by so many things. Your pastor is committed to learn to be still and to rest in Jesus. Why not take these same 3 months to join him? To jointly together along with him, and you in your space, he in his space, learn some of these same rhythms. Make it a priority in your life for these 3 months. As an individual, maybe as a family, maybe even as a congregation. What does it look like for a congregation to be one that enters into the rhythms of rest and silence and solitude? What does it mean to be a people who abide in the vine? Listen to what pastor and author Warren Wiersbe says. I'm gonna finish with this. Wiersbe says, the most important part of the Christian life is the part that only God sees. Most important part of the Christian journey, the Christian walk, is the part that only God sees. Without time at the Lord's feet, in His presence, cultivating a relationship with Him, we'll find ourselves busy, very busy, but not particularly blessed. Our blessing is found in knowing Him who deeply knows and loves us. Thanks be to Him. Let me tell you a little bit about the brook trout as we come to the Lord's table this morning. I don't know how many of you are fishermen, but I'm told the brook trout is made for the current. It's wired, it's designed for the current. Everything about this fish, its shape, its size, its structure, the fish thrives in the fast water. It's at its best when it's swimming upstream, hard at work, swimming upstream. But even the brook trout, this fish that's designed for this, who's made for it, even the brook trout from time to time slips to the side of the bank where the current is less, not in the center where the current is strongest. Sometimes the brook trout will even slip behind a rock where it's even more protected from the current. It won't stay there for long, but it takes a time out. It takes time to rest. There's a pattern to the brook trout's life. It's in the current, it's out of the current. It's in the current, it's out of the current. We need a similar pattern in our own lives. You see, we are designed for life in the current. Again, Jesus' point was not don't serve. We're designed for life in the current. Ephesians 2 verse 10 says, we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works. Works, in fact, that He prepared in advance for us to do. That blows my mind. I'm wired for service. You're wired by your Creator for service. God created us to swim upstream in the fast current. But from time to time, God calls us out of the current. He calls us to slip to the side of the bank where the water is flowing more gently. He invites us behind the protection of a rock, actually the protection of the rock, where the current swirls around us and over us rather than pushing against us. God has prepared this table longing for it to be one of those times. He says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. Slip out of the current for a moment and let my body and let my blood renew you and restore you and strengthen you. Come and be nurtured. Come and be strengthened. I have plans for you. I have work for you to do in the current. But first you must draw aside and be reminded of my love. First you must draw aside and come close to me. This is my body given for you. This is my blood shed for you. Tokens of my love, signs and seals of my love for you. And so I want to invite you this morning to receive them in this quiet place. This place apart from the busyness and the demands of your life. Take them in these few still moments and know that your God is with you and that you belong to Him.